as you begin to learn this information, that it starts to coalesce and those connections start to occur. And so the topic of today, when it comes to behavior analysis, there's so much that we can talk about, and certainly Yendri and I, it was a challenge to narrow it down to only certain things to talk about. And I think the topic that we're going to discuss today is one that is one of the most important. Not that the others are less important, but it's one that, especially, you know, with younger children, or really children at any age, that this content is so relevant. So I hope that after today, you guys get excited about, you know, teaching skills and learn some great ways to maintain those skills, which is our topic for today. So as with the other webinars, we're just going to kick off with a little bit about us. And so I am Janet, and my co-host is Yendri. She's also, depending upon how your squares are set up, she might be right below me. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about us. So Yendri is an amazing board-certified behavior analyst, and she has oodles of experience, over 10 years of experience. And her area of expertise, although she worked many years in providing clinical services to children with autism, her area of specialization is training. And so her company, Scalometry, provides, you know, top-notch trainings to behavior therapists. And in particular, she provides the registered behavior technician training, both the 40-hour training and the competency assessment. And I have to give a shout out to Yendri, because not only has she trained so many people, but her training curriculum has a 99% pass rate for the RBT. So it's really a phenomenal training that Yendri provides, and a wonderful service to our field. So thank you, Yendri, for being here. And then
thank you.
And then as for me, I'm also a board certified behavior analyst. To date myself, I've been in the field for about 20 years. I love what I do. I have expertise in the clinical delivery of services, so ABA therapy to children with autism, and I'm currently the chief executive officer of a company called ABA Squad that provides ABA therapy to kids with autism. But aside from that, I've also worked with businesses providing organizational behavior management. And then one of my passions is teaching, and that's why I'm here with you guys today. And so I also teach at Florida International University, undergraduates there, really kind of empowering and impacting the next generation of behavior analysts by teaching intro and advanced courses in behavior analysis. So that's a little bit about us. So just to give you an overview of what you're going to encounter today, very similar structure to webinar 1 and webinar 2, is we're going to start off with just a summary of webinar 2. I'd love to do a summary of webinar 1 and 2, but time is limited, so we're going to constrain it to just a brief summary of webinar 2. But then we're going to go into the topic for today, which is all about techniques on how to teach new skills. And then once you teach those, how to maintain them, and some things that you can be using to essentially see the fruits of your labor and to see those wonderful behaviors and skills carry out over time. And then we'll end our time with questions from you guys. But as last time, we definitely, if you're joining us for the first time, if you're here as part of the series and you join the other ones, bear with us for a moment here, because you've definitely heard this before. But if you're joining us for the first time, we definitely want to share what is the goal of this series. And as it says here on your screen, it's to teach you about basic principles that affect behavior and how to use those principles to affect meaningful change in your life. And that's really what the Kidvincible program is about. And this mini-series is a very, very truncated version of a larger program that we call Kidvincible that is really focused on that, giving you real, tangible information that can positively impact your life and the life of your family. So as you guys have seen, this is webinar 3. For those of you guys that weren't able to make webinar 1 and 2, you can see that webinar 1, we talked about an introduction into ABA, so just some key concepts on what the science has taught us about applied behavior analysis. And then webinar 2 was a really great webinar, giving you those tangible takeaways on strategies that you can use right away to start impacting problem behavior and essentially decreasing those behaviors. And so today we're going to end our time together in this mini series by then switching gears and teaching you some ways to not only help your child acquire new skills, but then how to maintain those. Okay, so let's first go back to a brief summary of webinar 2. And in webinar 2, we talked about some antecedent approaches that you could take to prevent behavior, as well as some consequence-based ones that I'll summarize next. And the ones that we had talked about, and the caveat I have to issue here is that this is not a full list of all the amazing strategies that the science has tested and is tried and true that are available to us as practitioners and you as parents. But it's certainly, Yendri and I chose these 6 because we felt like, one, it can have direct relevance to your day-to-day life now, and it was relatively easy to put it into use. And so those involve non-contingent attention, meaning that if your child is engaging in problem behavior for attention, that if you just provide that attention on a predetermined time basis, like on a predetermined schedule, then what it's going to do is make attention less valuable. So that way they don't have to engage. They're not motivated to engage in the problem behavior for your attention because they're already getting it. So that was one simple strategy that we talked about. Another one that I think is such a simple one that sometimes we forget how powerful it is the power of giving choices, right? So instead of just giving your child a directive of, hey, go do your homework or go pick up your toys, maybe you could, say, hey, do you want to do your homework first or do you want to pick up your toys first? And just a simple act of providing them a choice can make all the difference. And then we also talked about behavior momentum, which is just a fancy way of, it's this kind of fancy way of saying you're going to build a momentum of compliance and get them to do the task that might cause an issue. So if, let's say, it's the big task that typically issues or causes a problem is that it's time to do homework. Well, maybe you issue little tasks first, like put your homework, your worksheet on the table and put your pencil on the table, and little simple tasks to build that momentum of compliance. The fourth one that is also like giving choices, something very simple that we can tweak that can make all the world of difference, is the clarity of your instruction. And remembering that when you're giving instruction, to tell your child what to do, not what not to do. So if you want your child to come in through the door walking, then your instruction would be like, hey, remember to walk nicely when you come into the house, as opposed to saying don't run, right? Because we talked about this last webinar, that don't run then leads into speculation about what you do want. Do you want me to skip? Do you want me to gallop? So instruction clarity can make the world of difference. And then we also talked about fading tasks. So if you know that there's just the size, the sheer volume of the task is going to lead to problem behavior, then maybe chunking it up, breaking it up, where it's smaller tasks and kind of building their endurance, if you will. So eventually you can just give them the big task. And then the sixth one, that when I was a practitioner for many years out in the field, almost every behavior program that I wrote had this strategy because it was just so effective, was using advance notice. Now, sometimes you can couple that with a visual schedule, but just simply telling the child in advance, remember, we're going to do this, particularly when there are changes in the schedule. So we talked about that. last webinar. And then we also provided you with some consequence-based strategies. So remember, these are strategies that, that come into use after the behavior has occurred. And those involve using strategies such as behavior contracts, which can be a lot of fun. I know Yendri gave some beautiful examples of where she had a child that she worked with, where she had asked her, you know, if her dog could sign the contract, and she had said yes, absolutely. And it was just fun, but it's literally a written contract indicating what behaviors you want to occur, when you want them to occur, what will happen when they do them. And the focus of these contracts is positivity. Tell them what you want them to do and what good thing will happen by doing that. And then we also talked about first then strategies. Is if you know that your child has to do their homework, then, you know, once they do their homework, you know, immediately after, reward that behavior with something they really enjoy doing. So maybe it's one of these things where they do their homework first and then they can watch their favorite TV show or something like that. The third strategy that we talked about under this consequence-based bucket is we talked about ignoring what we call junk behavior, right? It's those behaviors that don't present safety risks. Obviously, those we cannot ignore, but maybe like some whining or some, you know, rolling the eyes, things that you can safely ignore, so that way those behaviors go down. And so we talked about that. We also talked about timeout. One of the things that Yendri and I as practitioners, we are always an advocate of using reinforcement-based procedures first, so things like behavior contract, things like first then strategies, but we wanted to include timeout because timeout is so common, you know, in the home. And so if it's something that you're already using, we wanted to give you some ways to alter its use so that way it's effective for you. And we talked about the importance of creating a distinction between the time in and the time out. So when you do send a child to timeout, making sure that that timeout environment is really devoid of the things they enjoy doing. And the example that I gave was sometimes it's so easy to say, go to your room when they engage in a problem behavior, but going to their room is not really a timeout environment because they have all these amazing things like, you know, their Xbox, and there's, you know, big screen TV, and there's smartphones or whatever they have. So, you know, that's really important that, you know, your timeout is highly differentiated from your time in. And then the last strategy that we put in, because I know some of you are parents with children with autism, and safety is such an important aspect of what we have to do, that we wanted to give you a strategy that really focuses on safety. For those of you that are working with, you know, behaviors that are, say, physically aggressive or those kind of things, response blocking is one of those techniques that you can use that essentially just helps to ensure safety by, you know, preventing or stopping the response. So if let's say a child goes to aggress to another child, response blocking would be, just as it sounds, physically blocking that response so that way they don't hurt themselves or others. Okay, so now let's get into our topic for today. So I'm going to start us off with all about teaching new skills. And there's 3 pieces of information under this category that I'd like to provide to you. One, I'd like to answer the question of what are skills? So we all kind of talk about skills, but from a behavior analyst point of view, what is this, right? And then once we are on the same page in terms of what skills are, then we're going to give you 2 ways to train skills. And one of them is called discrete trial training. The second one is called natural environment training. And then, of course, when you talk about teaching new skills, you have to talk about how the heck do I maintain these skills over time? And so we're going to give you some strategies on how to maintain them. And that's going to come after teaching new skills. But once we get through those two methodologies for teaching new skills, I'm definitely going to give you some strategies on how to get the most out of your teaching time with your child. Okay, so let's first take a look at answering this question of what are skills? And so from a behavior analyst point of view, skills, we look at skills as a group of behaviors that are related in some way. So for instance, if we talk about, and certainly this is a term that you guys have probably heard many times, social skills, right? So when we talk about social skills, we're really talking about several different behaviors. Things like, and I just have a few here on the screen, but things like greeting, turn taking, sharing, these are all individual behaviors that essentially come together to make this group of behaviors that fall under a category of social skills in this example. And so when you're teaching, what essentially we're doing is teaching those individual behaviors that make up the group. And certainly Yendri and I have experience teaching myriad different behaviors. And one of the things that we find many times is when you're teaching a skill set, like for instance, social skills, that maybe there's some behaviors that the child already can do, such as greeting. But let's say sharing and turn taking is something they struggle with. And so that's where, we would come in and teach those specific behaviors. So essentially, they have a well-rounded and comprehensive social skills skill set. And so one of the ways, as I mentioned earlier, that you can train a new behavior within a skill set is called discrete trial training. And some of you may have heard about this. It's definitely not a new strategy. It was pioneered by an amazing researcher, Lovaas, and he developed, Ivan Lovaas, who designed a Lovaas method that is still used today, even though it was created many years ago. But he gave us this discrete trial format of training, which is using the three-term contingency that we talked about in webinar 1. So when you use discrete trial training, you're essentially presenting antecedents, which we learned comes before behavior. Then you're honing in on or targeting a particular behavior. So that's the behavior that you want to occur. And then you're providing a consequence that we learned in webinar 1 that comes after the behavior that makes it more likely to occur. So when you're using discrete trial training, essentially you are what we say consecrating behavior, or providing consequences to the behavior that make it much more likely, because these are skills. So we want those behaviors to happen in the future, right? And the most salient, I would say, characteristic, if you will, of discrete trial training is that it relies on intensity and structure. So a lot of the times when people are talking about discrete trial training, they'll talk about it in terms of it being teacher-led or therapist-led or parent-led training. And the reason that it's framed that way is because discrete trial, just like it says here on the screen, is highly structured. So you as the parent, or me as a practitioner or therapist working out in the field, when I'm using discrete trial, I would come in with a predetermined plan. These are the behaviors I want to work on. These are the antecedents I want to present. And these are the consequences I want to provide to encourage that behavior to happen in the future. So that's really the most salient feature of discrete trial, is that it is a type of training methodology that is predetermined, that's structured by whomever is leading that training session, which it could be a parent, it could be a behavior analyst, it could be a therapist, it could be a teacher. So now let's look at an example of discrete trial training. So for instance, in this first square that you see here, I lay out an antecedent. The parent tells the child, point to the picture of the car. So imagine that you have this array of cards. One of them is a picture of a car, maybe the other one's a picture of a dog, maybe another one's a picture of an apple, right? And the parent has this array in front of the child and tells the child, point to the picture of the car. And then the child, here the behavior, points to the picture of the car. And then you as the parent, what we say, consequate that behavior or provide a consequence to that behavior by saying, that's right, and gives the child a high five. So you're coming in with a predetermined antecedent and coming in with a predetermined consequence. So now here's another example of discrete trial, because here's what happens is in this first example, the child gives you the correct response. But you guys know that sometimes when you're teaching new behavior, you don't always get the right response. So it's like, what does discrete trial look like if the child tells me the wrong answer, right? So it's still, one of the things that you'll notice from this second row here is that it still follows the same sequence in that it's still a teacher-led training opportunity in which you come in with an antecedent, and it looks very similar to when the child, it's actually the same as to when the child gives you the correct response. So you come in, imagine that array again, and you say to the child, point to the picture of the car. And now the child points to the picture of the truck. So clearly this is not a behavior you want to reinforce because it's not the correct response. So then what happens in discrete trial training? You're still going to provide a consequence, right? You're still going to do something after that incorrect response. But here, this box here shows that you're not providing reinforcement. Instead, what you're doing is representing that antecedent, right? So you're not acknowledging, you're not saying to the child, that's wrong, that's not the car, right? What you're doing is you're just immediately representing the antecedent and now providing some help to the child. And as we move on ways to get the most out of your training, we'll talk about what that exactly is. So I'm describing it, but not telling you the term because it's coming later. But what you see here is essentially the 3-term contingency that you learned from webinar 1 applied in discrete trial training. So now let's compare and contrast that to another method of training new skills, because now we just went through discrete trials. So now let's talk about natural environment training. And one of the things that you're going to notice right away is that both use this 3-term contingency, but they use it in a very, very different way. So recall in discrete trial training, I had said that we really find ourselves describing that as like teacher-led or parent-led or therapist-led training, where natural environment training is the complete opposite. It's what we call child-led training. Why do we call it that? Because here, right in this first bullet, it says it's unstructured because you're using the child's motivation to essentially guide what you're teaching. So as you're kind of wrapping your head around this, imagine this scenario, right? I'm in discrete trial training. What that looks like is I'm bringing all my materials, say to it, my workspace, right? And I know exactly what I'm going to run and when I'm going to, ask for the child to do certain things, right? Where in natural environment training, I don't have anything pre-programmed. Now, because of that, natural environment training, in my opinion, is a little bit harder to use, right? Because you really have to be vigilant, right? You have to look at that child and see, where is that child going? What's that child interested in? What does that child seem to be motivated to do? So, and then how can I seize that opportunity to essentially provide the antecedent to make that behavior occur? Okay, so it could be that in natural environment training, maybe you only get that behavior to happen once, because the child is only showing motivation for it to happen once. Whereas in discrete trial training, maybe you could get that behavior, that new behavior to occur many, many times, because you're essentially guiding and dictating, if you will, if I can use that word, when that behavior is going to occur. Where in natural environment, you're not doing that. You're kind of sitting back and saying, okay, I'm going to see where the child is going and how I can seize that opportunity. And one of the things I love about natural environment training, and I hope this is where you guys really see the value of this type of training, is that it can be done anywhere. Because it's not predetermined. So you could be at the grocery store using natural environment training. You could be at the park using natural environment training. You could be anywhere. You could be getting into your car with a child and use, natural environment training. And because of that too, and here's the other huge advantage, and you guys can see I'm a huge advocate of natural environment training, so you can kind of see where my biases are. But another huge advantage of natural environment training is because it can be used anywhere, you can get those behaviors to happen in new and different places. Where discrete trial, it's not that you can't have that happen, it's just that you have to plan for it, and it takes a little bit more work to make sure that it's happening. So some big advantages of natural environment training, as you can see. So now let's take a look as an example of natural environment training. So as you can see, as I said, you have the 3-term contingency. So it still involves, like discrete trial training, still involves an antecedent, still involves a consequence. But let's take a look at this scenario here. So the antecedent is, let's say I'm a parent and I'm outside. Let's say I'm drinking my lemonade on a beautiful Sunday, morning, and I'm watching my child play on the playground, right? And I see that my child is going towards the swing set, and I remember, we're working on turn taking. So I immediately go over to that swing set. Didn't plan this training opportunity, right? But I immediately go over to that swing set. And before that child gets on the swing, I ask the antecedent that gives the opportunity for training turn taking. And I say, whose turn is it? And the child says, it's my turn. And then immediately I come in with a consequence and I say, that's right, it's your turn. And then you push the swing. So again, the big stark difference between discrete trial and natural environment is that here in natural environment, you didn't plan that opportunity. You were on a beautiful Sunday morning, sunning yourself, getting your vitamin D, drinking your lemonade. And here your child you saw went for the swing set and you said, I'm going to seize this opportunity and work on some skills that we've been working on, in this case, turn taking. Okay, so now we're still talking about new skills, but now we're going to switch gears just ever so slightly, and we're going to talk about how to get the most out of teaching those skills. And this is where I said before that I'm describing something but not giving you the concept, the term behind it. And so now I'm formally introducing that term. It's called prompting. So what are prompts? Prompts is essentially just assistance that you're providing to the child, and it comes before the behavior. Now, one of the things I have to highlight is that when you think before, you're thinking, oh, then it must be an antecedent. Well, it's not the antecedent itself, right? So let's go back to that example of where you're telling the child to point to the car from an array. Well, let's say they gave you the wrong answer, right? And then you got to present that antecedent again, right? So you're still going to say, point to the car, but now you're going to come in with this prompt where you are going to point to the picture of the car. And that's the prompt. That's the level of assistance that you're providing that can help the child get to the right answer. Because remember, we learned in webinar 1 that the process that's going to help behavior happen more in the future is reinforcement. So what you want to do is when you get the right answer, whether the child does it on their own or with the prompt, is you want to come in with what we call a reinforcing consequence, right? You want to say, that's right, or something that really makes that child feel great about what they did. Maybe it's a high five, whatever works for you and your child. Okay, so now let's get into our first question for today. And so that question is, and I'm launching the poll for you guys, because I'd like to hear from you, is which of the following, based on what we just talked about, which of the following is not a way of teaching skills? Is it A, discrete trial, B, natural environment, C, consistent teaching, or D, all of these ways are ways to teach skills? So if you guys want to chime in the poll, I'll give you guys a moment to respond. Okay, I see some of you guys already coming in. And it looks like we actually have a little bit of a technical issue with our poll here. So forgive me a moment, just one moment here. I'm going to actually go to the right poll, because you guys are probably thinking to yourself, where's that poll? So let me go ahead and launch the right one. So here's the right one. So for you guys that answered the other one, you definitely got a sneak peek. But let's take a stab at this first poll here. So which one is not an example of a way to teach skills? So now I'll pause and give you guys a moment to respond. Okay, so I see a little bit of a mixed bag here. So let me go ahead and end this poll. And you guys can see that many of you answered C, which is absolutely correct. So we didn't talk about consistent teaching. That was something that I made up. Now, consistent teaching is important, but it's not an actual method that we talked about, like with discrete trial or natural environment training. So the correct answer again is C. Okay, so let's keep going here. Okay, so we talked about prompts and what they are. So now let's talk about types of prompts, because there's several different ones that you can tap into, and there's strategic ways that you can use them. And so I'm going to actually share with you 5 different types of prompts. Now, again, these are not the only types of prompts out there. So given our limited time, I'm going to teach these 5. And so they're called verbal prompts, gestural prompts, visual prompts, modeling prompts, and physical prompts. So I'm going to go back and then we'll take a deeper dive into each of those. So remember, a prompt is something that you do to help the child so that way they can, he or she can respond correctly. And so when you provide a verbal prompt, it's something that you say. For example, when you ask the child what animal says moo, you say cow, right? So that's something verbal that you're saying before the child responds that can help them get to the right answer, right? And then in this example, the child says cow. Now, let's see how that differs from a gestural prompt. So a gestural prompt, still a prompt, something you do to help the child get to the right answer. But in this case, it's not verbal. It's something that you gesture, that you do. So in the example here, it says, which picture is an example of a vehicle? And then you point, like in the example that I gave you when we were talking about discrete trial training, you pointed to the car. Well, now you have a name to what that example demonstrated, which is it used a gestural prompt. And then the idea is by providing that assistance, pointing to the right answer, the child is likely to point to the right answer. Okay, but then there's still 3 others, right? So you can also provide a prompt in the visual form. So for example, the child, you can show the child a picture of someone washing their hand to prompt them to go wash their hands. Right? So if, let's say it's time to clean up after dinner and you see that the child isn't going to the bathroom or to the sink to wash their hands in the kitchen, then you can actually use a visual prompt and just show them a picture, of someone washing their hands, and that could prompt the child to then go to the sink and wash their hands, right? So then now you also have what's called a model prompt. And just like it sounds, a model prompt is you're modeling what to do. So it's still a level of assistance that you're providing to help the child do the right thing in terms of responding correctly. But here you're essentially showing the child what to do. So the example that I show here on the screen is you say to the child, do this while you stand on one leg. And so you're showing the child that you're standing on one leg, and so the child copies you and stands on one leg, right? Now, we'll see that all of these vary in how much assistance we're going to talk about, and that's where we're going to go next. But the last prompt that I'm going to share with you is called a physical prompt, and that's also very intuitive, like the model prompt, where it's a level of assistance that involves you helping the child do something, right? So in this example, you say to the child, touch your head. Then you actually grab the child's hand and physically guide it to their head. So you're, in this case, we call it a physical prompt because you're physically helping the child, as opposed to, say, in a gestural or verbal prompt, or even a visual or model prompt. You're not physically helping them. You're helping them in a different way. Okay, so recall I said that these 5 different prompts vary on how much assistance they really provide to help your child get to the right response. And you'll see that it goes from what we call most to least assistance, or least to most assistance. And this visual here on the screen really does a nice job of showing you how this direction works. And we actually call this a prompt hierarchy. And that's why it's beautifully represented in a triangle, because it's showing a hierarchy. Now, don't think of verbal behavior because it's at the top, it's the best. It's just showing that it's the smallest, so it's essentially illustrating that it provides the least level of assistance. Whereas you can see here at the bottom, again, intuitively we might think, well, physical, it's at the bottom, so is that the worst? In this case, it's not at the bottom to demonstrate that. It's instead to demonstrate that it's the prompt that provides the most assistance, and that's why it has like the largest surface area here, if you will. And you can see that because physical is provides the most assistance, when you go up this triangle, you're going from most assistance to least assistance. But then when you go down the triangle, you're going from least assistance to most assistance. And so a big rule of thumb that you want to be mindful of when you're using these prompts is that you always want to try and end your assistance with the least level of support possible, right? So if, let's say, you have to fully assist that response to start, you want to try and provide additional opportunities for that behavior to occur, that skill to happen, to see if you can move to a lower level of assistance, one that provides less support. Because what that's going to do for you is it's going to put the child in a trajectory where they are moving towards independent responding, right? Because at some point you want this training to result in them doing it completely on their own, right? That's always the goal. And so one of the kind of the caveats I like to issue when I'm talking about prompts is that you want to be very, very careful that you try to always end on the least restrictive, or maybe even the least support, or maybe even no support. Because, as I said, you want that response to try and occur independently on their own. Okay, so let's go to our next poll and make sure that I choose the right one here. So the second poll here is, let me just double check. Yes, we're on the right one. So let's try this second question. So while you are teaching Johnny to identify a car in an array of pictures, you say to him, point to the car, and then grab his hand and guide him to the picture of the car. So here you have this array, you tell him to point to the car, and you physically grab his hand to guide him to the picture of the car. Which prompt is being used in this example? Is it a verbal, gestural, visual, or physical? And you guys are so fast. So many people responded here, and you're 100% correct. Yes, physical. And the key word here in this example is grab, right? Because we know that's something physical that you're doing, that physically guides that child. So kudos to you guys. Well done. Okay. So now let's keep going down the strategies of how to get the most out of your training or teaching opportunities with your child. So one of the ways we talked about was using prompts, but I'm going to introduce now another concept called instructional control. And this is just a fancy way of saying that it's creating a positive working relationship in which when you tell your child what to do, he or she follows through. And she or he follows through because in the past, when you've told the child to do something and they did it, you provided a reinforcing consequence, meaning that you provided a consequence that the child liked and encouraged them to do it in the future. So when you have a history of doing that, when you repeatedly do that, what that does is essentially create not only a positive working relationship where your child is eager to work with you, right? But also a situation that when you do work with your child, they're likely to follow through because you have this beautiful history of reinforcing the behaviors that you want. And it's important because without this instructional control, it's really going to be, at the end of the day, hard to teach. You can try to provide oodles of prompts and things like that, but at the end of the day, if you can't get them to follow through, then it's going to be really, really hard to make progress when you're teaching. So now when you're trying to promote instructional control, it's really, really important that you provide that reinforcing consequence every time. And we're going to talk about what that's called in just a minute when we talk about how to maintain these skills. But these two strategies, instructional control and prompts, all help to get the behavior to occur. The prompt helps the right behavior to occur, and the instructional control helps to make it likely that the child will follow through when you ask them to do something. So when you present an antecedent. Okay, so now that we talked about what are skills, how do we teach these skills, how do we get the most out of teaching, now let's talk about how to maintain these skills. And I'm going to talk about two things. The first thing I'm going to talk about is something called schedules of reinforcement. And it's a fancy term that we use to essentially just say when you're going to reinforce a behavior. So you guys learned in the 3-term contingency that a consequence is something that occurs after the behavior. So a schedule of reinforcement is essentially just saying when you're going to provide reinforcement, right? And there's two kind of broad categories. Now there's some very, very specific schedules, but because we're so limited on time, I'm just going to present two broad categories. But if you're interested in our full Kidvincible program, we take a deep dive into this because this is so important when you're teaching skills and maintaining skills. But the two categories are called continuous reinforcement, and another one is called intermittent reinforcement. And continuous reinforcement is just like when I said about instructional control, is that you provide a reinforcing consequence every time that behavior happens. So they respond correctly. You, for instance, provide praise and say, yeah, that's right, every single time, right? This is important when you're first teaching a new behavior, right? So maybe you're first teaching turn taking, right? Or something like that. But you're probably thinking to yourself, well, Janet, I have a lot of things that I need to do. I have 2 other children, and, I'm cooking dinner, or I'm helping them with homework. I can't reinforce every single time the behavior occurs. Well, I have really good news for you, because you only have to do that temporarily. because once you see that they got it right and they're responding correctly, then you can shift over to a different category of schedules that we call intermittent reinforcement. And that's really a category in which some of the responses, the behaviors are reinforced and some are not. And we call that intermittent because when we say, something's intermittent, means that sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. So this is really important for maintaining those skills, all right? Because essentially with intermittent, it's kind of like they don't know when reinforcement is going to happen. So they have to continue to do that behavior to see when it happens, right? So that's really useful when you're trying to maintain that behavior over time, which is a big part of learning new skills, because you don't want it just to go, essentially in one ear and out the other. You want it to stay in there and to continue to be used over time. Now, the second way to maintain it is it's a term called generalization, but essentially it's what I think of when I say the term use it or lose it, right? And so when I talk about use it or lose it, I'm talking about using skills in many different places, in many different situations, right? In behavior analysis, we call that generalization. And just think about, when things generalize, they get broader, right? Same thing when you teach a new behavior, that maybe at first it only happens with you. So maybe the child only asks for the things that they want with you. But when we start generalizing those skills, again, use it or lose it, right? It starts to happen with different people in different places. And that's how it can help maintain it too over time. Because think about it, if let's say the child is asking for the things that they want with you and grandma and their brother and their sister and their aunt and their cousins, right? Think about all those opportunities that essentially are being brought forth to, encourage that behavior to occur, right? Where if it's only happening with you, then it's going to constrain those opportunities. And that's why I really frame this as use it or lose it, right? And so a big piece of advice that I give to you guys as you're venturing into teaching your child these new skills is make sure that you collaborate with other people in the family, whether it's your spouse or, let's say they have an older brother and sister, encourage them to, use these strategies, prompt these behaviors to occur, so that way these skills start to broaden in terms of who they use it with and where. So what we could say is that they start to generalize. Okay, so I'm going to present the third question now, and this is where some of you got a sneak peek and already answered this. If you did, just bear with me. That was my technical difficulty. But let's go back to that first poll that I presented. And actually, I'm going to pause for a moment. I think I can relaunch it here. Yes, I can. Okay, so I'm going to relaunch the poll. So let's take a stab at this one. When teaching a new behavior, which schedule of reinforcement is best to use? Is it continuous, intermittent, or C, neither? And oh my goodness, you guys are so fast. 100% accuracy. Such a smart bunch. Yes, continuous, right? If the question was, what do I use if it's to maintain it, then the correct answer would be B. But I'm so happy to see that everybody got that response. Okay. All right, so that concludes our content for today, and we still have a few moments for questions. So I'd like to pause here to see if you guys have any questions. But while we're giving you guys time to chime in the chat, if the question's coming to mind for you, I just want to present a little bit more information. So for those of you guys that have your smartphones handy, all you need to do is open up your smartphone and go to the camera And if you scan the QR code on the screen here, it'll actually take you to a website where you can learn a bit more about our full Kidvincible program. And you can actually get put on a mailing list where we can get in touch with you and schedule a consultation to be able to get more information. So feel free to scan this QR code and visit the site for more information. The next piece of information, and I'll come back to this if you guys need me to. The next piece of information is I just want to give my contact information and Yendri's contact information. So there you can see our email addresses, our direct phone numbers, as well as our website. So I'm associated with ABA Squad, Yendri is associated with Scalometry, and you can go to our sites and learn a little bit more about what we do when we aren't doing webinars and spending our time with you guys training. And then the last thing that I want to scan or present here is an opportunity for you guys to scan another QR code. And one of the things that, and certainly as behavior analysts, we love this, right? We thrive on feedback. And so if you guys could be so kind, again, using your camera, just scan this QR code and it'll actually take you to a really fast evaluation form where Yendri and I can get feedback during our time with you. So that way in the future, when we do more webinars, we can definitely hone in on the things that are important to you. And so with that, I'll actually go into the chat. And I see that Daniela has chimed in. And thank you so much, Daniela, for your question. You said, do you have any strategies on testing? My son is too fast and not taking the time to read. That is a fantastic question. And certainly I know that once they become school age, you know, standardized exams are a big part, become a really big part of their life. And so one of the things, and unfortunately I only have 2 minutes left, but yes, there are things that you can do for testing. And the piece of advice that I would give you, and I actually worked with a child where this was part of the problem. It wasn't related to testing, but she would read the instructions of her homework. She would read it too fast and she would miss key pieces of information. And then she would just jump right into doing her homework and then she would do it wrong. So one of the things that I worked with her was actually timing. So saying, so providing reinforcement if she read the instructions within, say, you know, 1 minute as opposed to where she was now. So maybe like right now she's just looking at it for, say, 3 seconds, right? So if, let's say, in testing, if they're taking it too fast and not reading the question stem, then maybe what you can work on is per question, just providing reinforcement only when they have stayed and attended, essentially read that instruction for a certain amount of time. So, and what you're going to have to do, and certainly with the other QR code, or shoot me an email, because I am happy to get on the phone with you to give you more specific strategies, because our time is limited here. But certainly what you can do is find out how much time they're taking now, and then make sure that the time that you provide is enough time to allow them to read the instructions. So I hope that's helpful. But Daniela, I'm going to flash the other slide, because you have my email there and my phone number, as well as Yendri's. That feel free to give us shoot us an email, or feel free to give us a call, and we're happy to chat with you and be able to spend a little more time on that question. So I do want to go back to the evaluation QR code, and that actually ends our time. So Ivan, I defer and volley over to you.